Hi, Phil Slater here. Today I'd like to talk about stockouts, or more particularly the stockout metric, or the measure we use for checking the level of stockouts that we have. I find the stockout metric to be a somewhat peculiar measure because it's a bit one-dimensional. It actually measures what's happening with availability and ignores the whole issue of investment that's been made in the inventory. And so we need to be careful in the way we use that measure and make sure we have a balanced approach to the way we measure our inventory. So just what is a stockout? Well, a stockout occurs when there is demand for an item from our warehouse or storeroom, but the item isn't available. We don't have one in stock, hence it's out of stock or it's a stockout. What this tells us is whether our setup for supply of that item is actually making it available when it's needed. And if it's not available, therefore maybe there's something we ought to be doing about the setup we have for supply. And that might be the reorder point we set, the quantity we set, or indeed the other supply dynamics that we have set up. The problem with just measuring stockouts is it can lead you to overinvest in your inventory. Now, not that long ago I worked with a client whose stockout measure was that they had 0 stockouts. And that's often quite suspicious because it means that everything is always available. Now, together we conducted a review of their inventory holdings and identified what they needed to do to reduce their inventory. And we identified a 42% reduction in inventory, which they then went on and achieved. Now, that was achieved with no impact on their operational availability whatsoever. So their stockout measure, because that was their key driver, was actually driving them to overstock their inventory significantly. And they needed to use other measures on an ongoing basis to ensure that they got the right mix of investment and availability. Another issue with the stockout measure is that not all inventory is equal. You know, if you stock out of something that's critical, that may be a major problem. But if you stock out of something that's not critical, well, maybe we don't care quite so much. So measuring it just across all inventory doesn't really tell you the story, because if you're regularly out of stock that things that don't really matter, who cares? So here are 3 things that you need to consider about a stockout metric. First of all, it can be a useful measure of the supply settings that you have in your warehouse or storeroom. And if you have a high level of stockouts or regular stockouts with items, you can look at adjusting the way that you're supplying those items. Now, that just doesn't mean adjusting your minimum holding or your maximum holding. It might mean looking at the whole supply dynamics to make sure it's being supplied in a manner that makes it available when it's required. The second thing is that it's a lag indicator, which means that you only find out about a problem after it's happened. So in that respect, it is a corrective measure, so you can correct things afterwards, rather than a preventive measure. So it's probably not complete in terms of managing your inventory. And the third thing is, as I've already mentioned, not all inventory is equal, so it may be okay to be out of stock of some things at some times and not out of stock at others. You just need to make sure you're measuring what items you're actually going out of stock on. Now finally, let me say that just because an item goes out of stock doesn't mean it has to be stocked in your storeroom. You know, it might be okay to have it supplied within the window in which it's required, which means it could be supplied by a local vendor and they might be able to get it to you within an hour or two, and that may be okay. They may be able to get it to you much quicker. You just need to think through the whole supply dynamic to make sure that you're not falling into the trap of that client that I mentioned before, who is significantly overstocking their inventory.